Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Melbourne and to the Centre for Advancing Journalism. My name's Margaret Simons, I'm the Director of the Centre, and we're here tonight to discuss the post-mortem on media regulation, or specifically journalism regulation, about which a little more in a moment. First of all, I'd just like to say, for those of you who are live tweeting, the hashtag tonight is GoodJourno. Somebody suggested it should be bad journo, but that would beg even more questions than the first suggested hashtag. I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their elders and families. Now, before I introduce our panel, I'd just like to say a little bit about why we're doing this event tonight. We've put it on as fast as we can, basically, after the collapse of the government's attempts to alter the regulation of journalism. And the reason we've decided to do it is because at the Centre, while we have a diversity of views on staff about what the appropriate method for regulating journalism should be, we agree that a deficit in trust in news media is something that should concern not only journalists but all citizens. And yet, in the wake of the collapse of the government's legislation, there will be very few people who want to talk about it. The mainstream media have shown that they're vehemently against any change to the present system, and they're not going to revive the debate. The government has no wish to revisit its legislation, and indeed Senator Conroy said the other night on television that it was no longer government policy. The opposition has also said it doesn't support any change to the present system, and so if it mentions it will be only to beat the government over the head. And so while it is a vital public issue, there are actually very few people in public life who will want to talk about it. Now, that's something a centre such as this one can do. And I'm inspired in this view by the words of Lee Bollinger, who was the president of the Columbia University Journalism School, who said a great journalism school within a great university should always stand at a certain distance from the profession. It should be a loyal critic. It should reflect on the profession, drawing our attention to important issues and communicating these findings to students, the profession, and the interested public. And that's what we're aspiring to do tonight, and indeed why we're here. So just to briefly sketch out the context, most of you will be aware of the telephone hacking scandal in the United Kingdom and the Leveson inquiry which resulted from that. And while there is no suggestion of that sort of illegality happening in Australian journalism, partly as a result of that context, we got the Finkelstein inquiry here as part of a convergence review, which was into broader issues of media regulation, not only journalism. Following the reports of those inquiries, there was a very long gestation period before the government came up with some changes to media regulation, and the bit that was relevant to journalism was the suggestion of a public interest media advocate who would endorse self-regulation schemes, journalism self-regulation schemes, and those people who didn't sign up to such self-regulation schemes would lose their exemption from privacy legislation, which would make it very difficult to be a journalist in this country. Now, in parallel to those developments, which have been described as Stalinism and so on by some sections of the media, Julian Disney, who's the second on my left here, who's the chairman of the Australian Press Council, has been engaged in a reform process at the Australian Press Council. Now, the Press Council was established in the 1970s, which was the last time that there was the threat of government regulation and great political pressure over these issues. And I'm of the view that it may well be 30 years before we're in that situation again as well. So Julian's been engaged in a long-running reform effort which has run in parallel with these other developments, but in my view has gained from them in the sense that the publishers have been encouraged to reform themselves by the political pressure. But at the same time, one major publisher, Seven West Media, have opted out of the Press Council and created their own body. So what's going to happen now the pressure is off? Well, that's what we're here to discuss tonight. I also just want to say a little bit about the panel we have here tonight. I think while we have a diversity of views here, quite a strong diversity of views, I think everybody who's sitting on the stage tonight would agree there is an issue and it's worth discussing. And not everybody agrees with those views. We did invite, but they declined our invitation, Senator Birmingham, who was the coalition representative on the Senate committee which reviewed the government's legislation. Senator Conroy, the Minister for Communication, has had an open invitation to speak at the Centre for many months now. Senator Doug Cameron, who was the chair and government representative on the Senate committee. Paul Chadwick, former ABC Ethical Standards who's argued against increased regulation before the Finkelstein inquiry. And we also had hoped to have a representative from News Limited who indicated their willingness to attend but weren't able to identify a person in time for tonight's event. Now, I should say, before you draw any firm conclusions from that, we have pulled this on at relatively short notice, and that should certainly be taken into account. But now to introduce the panel. On my left is Jonathan Holmes, former executive producer of Four Corners, foreign correspondent at the 7:30 Report, but at the moment probably best known as presenter of the ABC programme Media Watch. To his left, Julian Disney, previously mentioned, who holds so many different posts. He's had a long history in law reform, economic and social welfare policy, but is presently the chair of the Australian Press Council, among other things. And to my far left, no pun intended, Senator Scott Ludlam, who's Senator for Western Australia and the Greens spokesperson on communications, as well, again, as a member of the Senate committee that scrutinised the government's proposed legislation. Now, in the wake of the developments that I've outlined, Julian Disney is very much the man in the hot seat. A question in my mind is what's going to happen to the reforms which he's pushed through at the Australian Press Council now that the pressure is likely to be off for, I suspect, at least a decade. And so I've asked him to start tonight by briefly addressing us. I've asked him to keep it to 10 to 12 minutes on how he sees the future from here, what he thinks the issues are and what citizens might be able to do about that. We're then going to have a panel debate about that, which I'll be moderating, and we'll open it up to questions and answers at the end. I'll try to remember to say this again, but when we go to Q&A, please do ask questions, not make statements. And also, please be aware that the event is being recorded and there will be a vodcast available on our site, so please keep that in mind when you're asking your questions. And also, please wait till the microphone gets to you as well. So I'll throw to you, Julian, the man in the hot seat, becoming progressively hotter.
All right, thanks, Margaret. Actually, after having heard all the people you'd invited to speak, I feel more like Steve Bradbury, but anyway. Firstly, just very briefly about what did transpire a month or so ago, without dwelling on the past too much. I think it was a tragedy that the process over the last 18 months or so, I think, really went badly astray. I think none of this is with the wisdom of hindsight. I said it at the time, I thought the wrong sort of inquiry was set up, the timetable was wrong, the follow-up after the report was far too slow. And there wasn't enough emphasis on the convergence review, which I think was a very important part of the picture. And whatever work went into drafting the bill didn't involve sufficient negotiation and consultation, and then the process in Parliament was far too rushed and made it impossible to have much chance of success. So I think overall it was a tragedy. The planets were more aligned than they will be, perhaps, although I want to be not too pessimistic about the prospects of the future, but I think it's a real tragedy that the opportunity was lost. I think one of the problems with the bill was that it appeared as if, or it could be made to look as if it was going to be too draconian. In my view, the greatest danger was that in practice it would actually be too weak. And that's a pretty difficult double whammy when you've needlessly, I think, rattled the cages of some people by the design of it to make it look more fearsome than it actually would have been. But in fact, you've developed something which I think would have been too weak. So that was a major problem from my point of view. Before looking at what we do next, I just want to emphasise, because some people question this, that there is a problem. There is a problem of media standards. It would be remarkable if any profession or industry didn't have room for improvement. So it shouldn't be seen as a huge indictment to the media to say that there is a problem, but I want to very unequivocally assert there is, and whenever one speaks to journalists, or almost every journalist I speak to, especially if it's one-to-one, they will admit that there are major concerns, not just to do with the viability of the profession and of the publications they work for, but also with the impact on standards of a number of things, but one of them is the impact of the internet. That helps, of course, in many ways, but it also hurts in others, and the financial pressures that are on journalists. We certainly see at the Press Council major problems of, and deteriorating problems in terms of failure to distinguish, for example, between fact and opinion, serious distortion and over-the-top abuse in opinion pieces, undue intrusion on privacy, especially in the form of photographs, failure to adequately check facts before particularly popping them up on the internet, and even more of a tendency than occurred in print not to check and give an opportunity to a person who's going to be the subject of criticism to comment. So there are definitely major problems, and we really need to address them. There's also a problem that I want to mention to do with freedom of speech, because there's a lot of talk about freedom of speech, and I think the discussion is often greatly distorted. In my view, for people to be able to have freedom of expression, if they're being fed false information or unreliable information which affects the views that they want to express, their freedom of expression is being attacked. If they're not given the opportunity by mainstream and dominant media to be properly informed and reliably informed, then their freedom of expression is really illusory. If, when they try to express views, they're intimidated into not expressing them by some elements in the mainstream media, that's an attack on freedom of speech. If they're not given any opportunity to express those views, or only given them briefly and then they're drowned out by another view, then that's attacking their freedom of speech. So frankly, freedom of speech with some of the so-called friends it has doesn't need any enemies. This is a major concern, I think, that we need to focus on what's real freedom of speech for as many people in the community as possible, not freedom of speech for a relatively small and powerful group who already have more than enough freedom of speech and are sometimes bent on denying it for others. In my view, there's much talk about the chilling effect of regulation on the media. I think there's a big chilling effect coming from the intimidation and the distortion that's occurring from some sectors of the media on people who want to express views that don't happen to chime with those of the dominant forces. So I think that's a major concern. Looking to the future, and after the debacle really of a few weeks ago, there's some causes for pessimism and some for optimism. In terms of optimism, I think we may get now a less defensive and confrontationist approach from some leaders in the media. There may be, later in the year, perhaps in next year, a less toxic political environment, and I think that's been a significant factor in all this. And from the point of view of the Press Council, there may be less diversion from the process that I was trying to get started. This has been really quite a diversion for the last 18 months from the work that we were trying to do. Sure, we've got more resources as a result of it, but we've been hugely diverted and distracted, and the amplitude of the sort of confrontation and obstruction that we've had to deal with, I think, has been increased, and that may perhaps diminish to some extent now. But of course, on the pessimistic side, now there will be less pressure on those publishers who don't feel as much cause for alarm about current standards. There'll be less pressure to maintain, let alone to strengthen the Press Council. I think there'll be continuing aggravation of financial pressure on publishers. And there may be less focus on what I think is really the most important part of all of the discussion here, which is how do we deal with and respond to a convergent media environment. To me, the solution to most of this stuff wasn't to be done just in the print world or even in the print and online world, but for a whole number of reasons, it was better to look at where we should move to in 3 or 4 years' time by developing a convergent media regulation system. I still think that's the main hope for making progress, but I'm not sure how much that will work. Now, I want to just talk about things in 2 areas. First, things that I think that the Press Council can do, be a struggle, but I think things that we need to try and focus on, and then other things which perhaps are mainly others, or certainly which others will need to be involved in. In relation to our own work, I'm hoping that we can now get back to what I was wanting to do 18 months or so ago, which is focus on the proactive work of developing a good code of conduct with clear, practical standards of practice, promoting them both in the industry and in the community, monitoring compliance with them effectively, incorporating them in training processes. I think standards, the development and the monitoring of standards, is a much more effective way of influencing standards within the profession than the reactive approach that's endemic in the complaints adjudication structure that has dominated the work of the Council in the past. Now, I said that when they first asked me if I'd come and chair the Council, so I'm not a convert to this. I'm very firmly of that view, but we've been diverted. The adjudications task is very demanding, but we really need to make sure, in my view, that it's an adjunct to the dominant work, which should be developing and monitoring effective standards. And I think there are good things that we can do in that area. In relation to dealing with the complaints, we must get faster than we have been. That's going to be a long struggle. It's not easy to strike the balance between speed and rigour, and sometimes those who call for speed can be the first to complain about excess speed in particular instances. I think also we need to have a broader spectrum of response to problems instead of it being an adjudication which then has to be published and the development of which often engenders a considerable spirit of obstruction and nitpicking from some of the people involved. We need to have a fuller spectrum of responses, including the expression of opinions in formal letters, etc., to publishers and to complainants, but falling short of the full adjudication process. We must hang on to and develop, I think, a unique role that we have in the Press Council, which is to deal with so-called third-party complaints. In other words, not just complaints by people who've been directly affected by the story in question. But that's hard to do. We're not doing it the right way at the moment. It's very important to hang on to it because so many people who want to complain don't complain because they fear, and I believe in many cases they're entirely justified, they fear that if they complain it will just make matters worse. Now, one of the ways around that is to take third-party complaints, but it's difficult to get that right. But also, and here I've changed my mind, I must say, since I spoke to the Finkelstein inquiry, I think we must now have the ability to initiate our own investigations rather than waiting for a complaint. There are just too many cases where people don't raise what, in my view, are clear breaches of our principles, and we're left impotent. And we must be able to address that. The other thing I'll say about our own situation is that although the attempt in the bill to put benchmarks onto a body such as the Press Council, which would have to be complied with, although that has failed, and I think the benchmarks proposed in the bill were wrong, I'm still keen for us to go forward with the benchmarks we proposed to the Convergence Review, to say that we will comply with those benchmarks, to have an independent panel that will report every 3 years on whether we are. But those are just objective benchmarks, things to do with, for example, do we have a majority of non-media people on our adjudications panels. But I also think we need to commit ourselves to a triennial independent report on how we're going. So some of the things that were attempted in the bill in a very ham-handed way, unfortunately, I think we need to take the initiative to show that we're fair dinkum about this, and particularly to keep us up to the mark. If we are able to make progress in this reform process, we must make sure it's not eroded in future. I'll just move on then very quickly to what others might do, and just 3 areas that I want to mention. The first is that I think it's terribly important for a whole range of reasons to encourage the emergence of what I'll very loosely call quality online news and comment outlets which reach a sufficiently critical mass to have an impact on mainstream Australia. We won't be able, our biggest problem in many ways is the lack of diversity, and I think it's false to argue that just because there are a whole stack of bloggers and other people contributing to this that addresses the diversity issue. It doesn't if there aren't many different sources of opinion that are getting into mainstream critical mass impacts on opinion. And our only hope there is online, and I think we've really got to try and encourage people in the online area to try and reach that critical mass. Now, there's some things that the Council can do to help that, but of course there are a lot of other initiatives that I've spoken with people in that area about. Secondly, I think we need to try and develop, by we I'm not talking about the Council, but generally those who are concerned about media standards, we need to develop a much stronger consumer voice in this area. It's fatal to just rely on a regulator, especially a regulator with the very limited powers of a body like the Press Council. It's not wise to rely on a regulator to be able to take on powerful interests on its own if there isn't a strong consumer voice. Or voices, and we really need that in this space. There are too many people who, for one reason or another, are not willing to express their concerns publicly, or if they do it in a way which is not designed effectively to maximise their impact. And without that, a regulator will always be limited and inhibited in its ability to have an impact. And the last area is what I've mentioned before, which is the need to particularly encourage a move towards a convergent media regulation system. Try and harmonise our standards with those that apply to broadcasting, try to work increasingly in a cooperative way with them, and amongst other things to make it easier for us to move when the planets are aligned, and often they get aligned at pretty short notice. You have to be ready. so that we are ready to try and move towards a convergent media regulator. And amongst other things, that will reduce one of the major problems that bedevils the council, which is the lack of secure membership and resources. And that's not so much to do with people threatening to get out or anything like that. It's to do with the insecure situation in the print media. And the more that we can get all the platforms together so that those platforms that are stronger can be part of a general system, the more that system will be able to be effective. But while it's focused just on print overwhelmingly, and print is struggling so much, it's going to be difficult. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julian. And perhaps the issue of consumer groups in media is something we could return to. But if I can just play devil's advocate for a moment for the purposes of this panel. Scott, I think the Greens advocated action in this area perhaps more strongly than any other side of politics. But don't we need a yellow press? Isn't the alternative a timid press and all the problems that go with that?
I think it's something of a false distinction, though, that I don't think we need in this space a government-backed statutory regulator that would intimidate the press. I think that would be an absolute disaster, and we wouldn't be voting for it if that was the model that was served up. But what I think we missed throughout this whole last chapter of the debate was, you know, we had front and centre on the front pages of the daily tabloid papers pictures of of the communications minister dressed up like he's Joe Stalin, like the spectre of a dictatorial government exercising power over the press is one thing. What about the spectre of media oligarchs who intimidate journalists in their own way? What about this enormous concentration of power and voice in the corporations that own this, you know, this sort of shrinking number of platforms, the mainstream platforms? Where does that get a look in? And you know, the powers that's vested in regulators, whether they be statutory or statutorily recognised self-regulatory bodies, are what we have as a democracy to keep in check these enormously powerful corporate unelected entities that control such a large part of the media space in this country, such a tight concentration of ownership. And so what we had in this most recent debate was the idea of freedom of speech conflated with freedom of media oligarchs to shunt assets around as though they're poker chips. And if you try and interfere with that process, you're interfering with freedom of speech. I think what freaked them out more than the proposed regulations around the Press Council was the idea of having a public interest advocate who would be potentially another check and balance on more mergers and acquisitions. I think that's what really upset them. It wasn't anything to do with freedom of the speech or a timid press. It was about an elected government attempting to place some kind of check over this extraordinary consolidation of corporate power that's occurred in the media space in Australia. And
if I can ask you just to do a bit of crystal ball gazing, what do you think is going to happen to Julian and the Australian Press Council now?
I think for the time being, actually, he's on his own, and I wish you well. You know, Margaret, you described it at the outset as a post-mortem. I think that's accurate. You know, a post-mortem is what you do when something is dead. And the idea of further legislative reforms of media in Australia in the next little while is dead, because the coalition simply backed those powerful commercial interests and sucked up to them. And I can say that because Simon's not here, although I probably would even if he was. And just reflexively backed the mainstream press and the Murdochs before they'd even read the package, before they'd even seen the bills. They were opposing it. So there you go. If we get a coalition government, you won't see anything. And any future vaguely progressive or centre-left government that has the bright idea that you might want to take these interests on is going to get shut down, because the bullies came to town and they won. So that's the lesson. I'm here with the glass half empty tonight. And when you call it a post-mortem over something that's dead, I'm nodding.
It's completely empty, actually, but there is a bottle there.
It's completely empty.
Now, Jonathan, one of the questions that was asked at the Finkelstein inquiry by Greg Hywood, who's the CEO of Fairfax, is what's the problem? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Do we have a problem? Do you agree that there's a problem?
Well, I agree that we have the problem that Scott outlined. Clearly, we have, and indeed Julian, we clearly have a problem of media concentration in this country, mainstream media concentration. I agree that although there is hope for the future, at the moment, all the proliferation of small online outlets does not remotely compensate for the enormous power of News Limited in particular, and let's admit it, the ABC, which is the only other gorilla in the room. We like to say Fairfax is the third gorilla, but it's getting more like a chimpanzee, and it might be, you know, a monkey pretty soon. That's a huge issue. I don't agree that there's much, frankly, that regulation can do about it. Yes, the public interest media advocate might have stopped even further concentration, but you can't wind the clock back. That, you know, the Herald and Weekly Times was bought by News Corporation back in 1988 or 9 or whatever it was, mainly because the then Labour government was on a crusade to limit the power of Fairfax. And nobody is going to be able to buy those newspapers. I mean, if, supposing in some fantasy world, a government should actually try to deprive News Limited of half its tabloid newspapers, you can't imagine it happening, but who in the world would buy them? They're not on their own any longer going concerns. The only way News Limited is surviving, and it's not surviving as healthily as it would like you to think, is because Kim Williams is ruthlessly forcing all those mastheads to lose their individual identities, to pool their resources into one nationwide news operation. And Fairfax is doing the same. So, you know, effectively, individual, you know, say the Adelaide Advertiser, could not, I don't believe, exist as a viable financial going concern if it was on its own. The West is surviving in the West, but it's backed by another huge conglomerate, you know, which includes the most successful television network in the country. So there's, you know, that's the big problem. What I would say is not nearly as much of a problem as most people think it is what Finkelstein called the pursuit of individuals, the unfair treatment of individuals. It might seem a strange thing for someone in my position, Media Watch, to say, but the number of individuals who are badly treated by the media in this country, whose privacy is invaded, who are, in other words, done over, and Meg is one of them, is not nearly as high as you would think. I did a little count tonight on the stories. We've done about 23, 24 stories on Media Watch this year. 3 of them concerned individuals badly treated by the media. One was a New Zealander who was recorded by News Limited's Jonathan Marshall in a way that would have been illegal if it happened in Australia. One was Hilary Mantel, the British author, who was far worse treated by the British media than she was by the Australian media. And one was a guy who was done over by that pillar of journalistic rectitude, the ABC's Background Briefing. Those are the only 3 examples of individuals badly treated, and every other year it's not that many either. We don't have hundreds of people who are victim of phone hacking and so on. And I argued at the time, and I would still say, that protecting those, even though it's true that the way in which those people can appeal and deal with it when that does happen is inadequate. I think Julian's reforms are helping a lot in that respect. Hopefully they will continue. But it was not ever a justification for the fairly draconian statutory regulator of the print media that was being proposed by Finkelstein.
And what do you think will happen now?
I think there is a very grave danger that Julian's reforms, which he may deny this, they were certainly, and it should be said, News Limited was very supportive of what Julian was trying to do before Finkelstein ever happened. Campbell Reid at News Limited, I think Julian would confirm, was one of his biggest allies. And it was some of the other media organisations, especially the West, that were, and to some extent Fairfax, who were opposed to those things. Now, it was the pressure of Finkelstein that I think helped Julian get a lot of those important reforms over the line. I wish Stephen Conroy, when he was justifying what he wanted to do, had stood up and said, great, good on the Press Council, but we have to keep up that pressure that Finkelstein represented. And that's why we need, I mean, I didn't like the idea of the PIMA as it was formulated, but some kind of external check on the Press Council to ensure that those reforms, there's no backsliding. As it is, I think it would be very easy for people to look at the way that Seven West Media's gone and say, well, that looks pretty cheap and pretty easy, and, you know, why would we want Julian getting into up our noses all the time? We'll go and set up our own little council. I think that could easily happen.
And so that's the next question really, and perhaps Julian, you'd want to comment on this. What is the risk that every media organisation will have its own in-house system and say, well, why do we need the Press Council now? We'll give you our notice and our contracts and we'll do it all ourselves.
Well, it's important to bear in mind that the West Australian is pretty unique in that one thing is it's the only of the three substantial sort of newspaper empires which is in one state, and so to the extent there may be savings in that system, they're largely to do with the fact that it's a one paper, one city operation by and large. If you're doing it nationally, it wouldn't be so simple. I'm not hugely worried about that in the immediate future. I do think we need to address it, and I do think that the proposals the Convergence Review made in that respect were right, and that over time privileges that journalists get will have to be dependent on them being subject to an appropriate standards body. To me, that's elementary. And I might say in passing, if I think easily the best proposals on what should be done have been produced by the New Zealand Law Commission just in the last few weeks. I think it's an outstandingly good report which focuses on a convergent environment, firstly, which I think is important, but secondly, it focuses on the point I made earlier about how do you set up a system which, in addition to trying to ensure adequate media standards for the usual reasons, also encourages the sort of quality online publications that I've been talking about. The starting point with that report is to say we really need quality online, but these people need to have the same privileges as other journalists. They need to be properly recognised as journalists, but if they want that, then they've got to comply with the same standards that have applied to other journalists. Just in terms of pessimism and optimism, I suppose my attitude's partly influenced by the fact that when I agreed to go to the council, I didn't envisage any statutory action. I didn't have any hope of that. That wasn't on the horizon. So the fact that it may be off the agenda now is, perhaps a pity, but I didn't expect it when I started. But also, I didn't expect that you could achieve dramatic changes in this. I think this is I think this is one of the mistakes that people often make if they're seeking reform. If this was easy, it would have been done. It's not easy. There are very powerful forces involved here. It will take a long time to develop an adequate system. I only see the council under me as, taking the baton a certain distance and passing it on. That may sound very prosaic, but I'd rather be prosaic and realistic than just have crazily unrealistic expectations. And I'd finish by saying, although it's kind that people think that we've made great progress in the last year or two, I don't think we've actually made very great progress. I think people often rather kindly overstate what we have done, but then I think on the other hand, they might understate what I think we can do. I think we can go back to what I was trying to do 2 years ago. And that was without statute. Sorry.
But don't you think that the standards are actually not really... I don't think there's much disagreement in the journalistic world about the way people ought to behave, is there? There's not much disagreement about the ethical standards that ought to apply.
Yeah, I think there is actually. There's... well, not actually amongst journalists so much, but perhaps amongst editors. And there's a very big difference in many newspapers between those two. No, I think, and also I think there's, in a number of areas, there's an erosion of standards, and journalists say that to me often. For example, the fact-opinion divide that I spoke about, the opinion headlines above news stories, that's become absolutely standard in the last year or two. The digital alteration of photographs in a demeaning way is becoming much more common. I can see it almost month by month, the deterioration that's occurring. And one of my worries is that if we don't at least add our small voice to saying this isn't the way to go, others will feel competed down to that. So, but the other thing is that we need to, some of the standards in our code and in the newspapers' codes invite being ignored by journalists because in my view they're unrealistically utopian. They're aspirational. Well, I don't mind aspirational standards, motherhood stuff, but I also like stuff that is realistic and practical and that you then insist on. And that's been our weakness, and what I'm wanting is things that are realistic, practical, readily accessed by journalists on the run, and that we then really get stuck into and say, you didn't do that, you should have. The standard makes it very clear. It's not some generalised waffle about, respecting privacy. It actually says what that means in terms of whether you can take photographs from public land on private land. And even at that basic level, many journalists are taught that if you're on public land, you can take photos on private land in whatever way you like. Now, that's not correct as a matter of law or in other ways. So I think there is quite a lot to be done there to get the standard practical and realistic, readily accessible. Promote, not through adjudications are not the best way of promoting what we think. If I was to be told by a newspaper that, they'll print over a year, let's say 12 articles of 700 words, I'd say don't bother with our adjudications. I'd say print our stuff on standards. That's much more important.
Let's move the debate a little bit further. Can I ask how many working journalists we have in the audience at the moment, if you could put your hands up? Okay, thank you. And how many people are not working journalists but are tweeting or blogging, either now or planning to in the future? What's the difference between them, Scott? What is a journalist?
Scale.
Scale.
Oh, hold on. There were two different questions you just asked me.
Okay, well, answer.
Scale. I'm concerned about scale, and this is what the Convergence Review attempted to do, with some success, was regulate at scale. What an individual does in a tweet is just qualitatively different, in effect, to what a media conglomerate with, 150 mastheads under its control can do. So, and that's where you get this really interesting tension between the sort of libertarian position where you don't want to regulate speech at all, actually. Any government intervention in what citizens say to each other through any medium should be avoided. And yet, you've got us arguing at the other end of the spectrum for regulation over these very large entities, whether they be commercial or publicly owned. So to me, the very simple answer there is scale. And you don't want to, in fact, I don't think you could, mediate the kind of unmediatable electronic conversation that happens at the moment, that even the Daily Telly drifts into with this war on trolls. You can't regulate to stop people from being mean to each other on the internet or in any other format. You can regulate to stop a newspaper from telling brazen, self-interested lies on its front page. So that's where we should focus. And in the middle, you've got a really interesting grey area that Convergence kind of dipped a bit of a toe into and then moved away. And they set their thresholds so as to not only to not catch bloggers, but to not catch Google or Apple. And we'll just kind of wait for things to converge a bit more before we take that challenge on.
Jonathan, would you like to bounce off that?
Look, one of the problems, I think, with all of this discussion is that probably if most people in this room were asked why we need better regulation, they wouldn't talk about those individuals so much as, and I'm sure that Scott would agree with this, what a lot of people perceive as monstrous bias on the part of one media conglomerate or another. There are plenty of people, possibly fewer in this room, who think that the ABC is monstrously biased on one side of politics. There are certainly plenty of people who think News Limited, and particularly some newspapers in News Limited, are really carrying, a coalition flag to a point where it's absurd. The point about this is, A, it obsesses everyone who writes to Media Watch or comments on my articles in the Drama or anything else. I mean, there is a huge vitriolic conversation going on about bias all the time. It seems to absolutely obsess people who are interested in the media. But it is almost impossible to regulate. I mean, sitting in the Media Watch chair, we're incredibly cautious about taking on bias as an issue. All of the standards say fairness and accuracy. They're both supposed to be there in the news. It's fairly easy to regulate accuracy. It's extremely difficult to regulate fairness because one person's unfairness is another person's dead-out truth. And there is so much perception of, the regulator is biased if they think this is biased, and so on. Ironically, the only time that I can think of in the last couple of years when Media Watch has taken on a particular story, which happened to be in the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, and said this is a one-sided biased story, the journalist concerned complained to the ACMA and I got done over. I was the one who had to apologise for unfairness. I mean, it was deeply ironic.
Was that fair?
Well, I mean, you know, whether it was fair or not, that's what the regulator found, and it's true. We didn't actually ring that journal up, and normally we do. And so, you know, I mean, that's not the point. The point is, it's something we I don't know what you think about this, Julian. I think the Press Council's made some reasonably courageous decisions on a couple of occasions recently.
Like Sir Humphrey.
Well, I mean, I just think it's a very tough thing for especially, you know, if it's hard for Media Watch, it must be much harder for a official regulator, whether it's a self-regulator or a statutory one. I mean, the ACMA was asked to rule against the way that climate change was being covered by the talkback radio hosts. It found on factual inaccuracy against Alan Jones. It didn't find on fairness because it said, oh, well, some other programme on 2GB has occasionally got a proper climate scientist on, that'll do.
Scott, I'm just going to ask you to respond to that. Sorry, Julian. I'll just ask Scott to respond to that. I'm keen to turn to questions from the audience.
Just triggered on the bias question, because I think sometimes it can be misleading. The very last thing you want is a regulator trying to eliminate bias in the press anywhere. For me, bias is only problematic when you get this enormous concentration that we have at the moment. Yeah. Bias matters a great deal if there's only one or two voices in the market. If there's raucous diversity, then the more bias, the better. As long as they're competing biases, that's what you're looking for.
Julian, did you want to?
Yeah, and that's really why, you know, media diversity is so important, and why I emphasise building up quality online. So I agree with that. Secondly, we don't talk about bias at the council, and I particularly don't like it because I'm not keen on standards that delve into intent or motive. And bias tends to be touching on the question of motive or intent. But I think the most fruitful thing in relation to what people call bias or lack of balance, and also in relation to fairness, is to try and break it down into what are the particular elements of this story which have led to the overall assessment that it's biased or unbalanced or unfair. And sometimes there are some elements that you can say shouldn't be done. And many of these are traditional practices that are being eroded, like, for example, contacting them, you know, the person who you're going to criticise, and giving them an opportunity to be heard before you do your first story. Not doing what's increasingly happening under the influence of internet, saying, oh, well, my deadline's in an hour. Well, it's not a real deadline, it's just a deadline you've imposed on yourself. I can't speak to the person who's the subject of the story. I'll get them a few hours later, so I'll whack that in. I can do that on the internet now, so I'll put it in later. But, of course, the story's already gone out. And is permanently there, the first story. So there are elements of what are called bias or unfairness that you can focus on rather than the overall assessment. Also in relation to opinion pieces, while one needs to allow a very wide range for expression of opinion, one can at least have some basic test in relation to factual accuracy. I don't think, I mean, some columnists have said to us there are absolutely no requirements of accuracy at all in opinion pieces. Now, the ACMA view, for example, and our view as we've tried to tease this out, is that's not entirely correct. That, broadly speaking, there must be, to use some of the terminology in other places, a credible factual basis or a tenable factual basis for what you're saying.
Well, you shouldn't be able to talk nonsense, should you?
No, though, of course, the problem here is that people have different definitions of nonsense. But just to finish on that, a test I always say to our staff and to the council is what one might call the Abbott-Gillard test. I always say, if we've got a complaint, change the issue, change the people, see how you feel about it. That helps to take your own prejudice out of it. We had a complaint once about some person who I think must have been on the left, I can't think who it was, and some pejorative term that was being used about them, and was that, you know, offensive and a breach of our principles. And I said, hang on, let's run it past the Abbott Mad Monk test. If we're not offended by Abbott and Mad Monk, or if we are offended but think that's okay in discourse, we can't pick it up on the other side of the fence. I think you've always, so if you're thinking about prejudice, bias in the media about, let's say, climate change, you've got to pick another issue and think about how it would apply there. Otherwise, you're letting your own prejudices have too much impact. And this is coming back to what Scott said, and which I agree with, is that the main response to bias is not to regulate bias. It's to perhaps pick out some of the things that contribute to it and say that's no good, and it's to encourage diversity.
Absolutely.
But I agree with you, it's what most people are concerned about is bias.
And of course, you know, the fact that there is so much concentration of popular media power at the moment, that is, of course, the issue. Just that I don't know what you do about it, and I think it will gradually improve rather than get worse. It might get worse first. You know, like Fairfax might collapse, which would be a huge tragedy, I think. I don't say collapse, but I mean, certainly, you know, we might find we don't have printed newspapers, and it's under crisis. But I have to say, I reckon in 10 or 20 years' time, we're going to have far more diversity than we've got now, one way or the other, in terms of news that people can find very easily. Whether they do find it, of course, if they're not people that are interested, is another matter.
So some of today's bloggers and tweeters will scale up, in other words.
Yeah.
I'm keen to explore this issue, but I'm also of consumer activism in this area, but I'm also keen to throw to the audience for questions, so perhaps it might arise out of some questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw to the audience at this stage. Again, please remember that you're being recorded. Before you ask your question, please do make it a question, not a statement or a speech, and please wait for the microphone to come to you. We have Fiona and Lucy here with microphones. So do we have a question from the audience? If not, I've got another dozen or so. No. Goodness. Okay, well, perhaps I'll turn to this issue of consumer activism. You mentioned it, Julian, as something that citizens could do. And of course, it's clear that in the UK, one of the things that has made a political difference is the existence of Hacked Off, which has got that wonderful combination of people who've been deeply wronged and celebrity muscle, sometimes overlapping, not always. What would you like to see here? What do you think would be useful in Australia?
Well, one thing that the council started, and it's a classic example of what we're now getting back to, is not directly consumer activism, because that isn't our role, but we have started holding community roundtables. We held them in 4 states about 18 months ago, where we asked 20, 25 or so community leaders from a very wide range of backgrounds, police, schools, religious, welfare, unions, business, etc., just to talk in a small group about what their concerns were. They repeatedly said, we don't complain about anything because it will only make things worse. But I think that process will build up and do more frequently, and that may in fact encourage some of them to try to work together to help address some of these issues. And we'll do it, I hope, at a national level with a community advisory group. I've always believed, really, and I did a paper on a report on reform of the legal profession about 30 years ago, and took the same view that it's really important not to overstate the impact of a regulator. They'll inevitably be in the middle of a spectrum between the industry and whatever consumer voice there is. And if there isn't a strong consumer voice to balance the industry voice, the regulator will be pushed and sucked too much towards the industry end. And if you take a body like the Press Council, where we have industry members and public members, the industry members have a ready-made support base and ginger group. It's the industry. The public members don't. They're on their own. No one particularly to support them or ginger them. So there needs to be processes to encourage sensible people to contribute to our work, but they also may go off and do other things. The other thing I'll just say in terms of ourselves is we do need people, if they are concerned about what they see as patterns of behaviour in the media, we do need them to think perhaps with others and really work out a good complaint to bring to us, and bring it to us in a well-researched way and put it in a good way. We can't solicit complaints, of course, but we can say, look, don't just keep raising things as does happen to us in a scattergun, ineffectual way. You've got to get your act together and put the case to us properly. We don't have the resources, but also it's not our role to be delving too much and, you know, building up one side of the case. People need to be able to put it to us effectively and match the resources which will be brought to bear on the topic by the publisher.
Jonathan?
Well, of course, you know, the way that consumers are reacting now is putting the fear of God into the big media is through social media. And we've seen a couple of classic examples recently. The Destroy the Joint Twitter handle or hashtag was used to create an enormous amount of pressure on 2GB in particular over Alan Jones, which and when that combined with the row over his speech in which he said that Julia Gillard's father had died of shame, and there was also a, I think it was Choice.org, what's it called, Change.org, another petition. Those social media movements created so much pressure on advertisers that a lot of them, temporarily, admittedly, pulled out. And the same thing happened with the famous prank call to the hospital in London. There was a case quite recently of a young girl who died in a quad-back accident in New South Wales, and Channel 7 flew a helicopter over and took pictures of her while the girl was still on the ground. The Illawarra Mercury got a photographer to smuggle himself in onto the private land. It was quite a big property, and he took photographs of the mother kneeling beside her daughter. These were all published. The mother, the parents launched a social media campaign on Facebook, particularly, which caused Seven to, I mean, their site almost crashed. The outrage was extraordinary. The Illawarra Mercury has just published, literally 2 or 3 days ago, a grovelling apology and say that it's going to completely reform the way that it takes photographs. I mean, they have achieved more, those two parents, than Media Watch has done in 21 years in terms of changing the way that the Illawarra Mercury, which is one of Stuart Littlemore's favourite targets, goes about its business. So I think that social media has handed an enormous weapon to the hands of people who are hard done by the media if they know. And these, you know, Molly Lord's parents were extremely active, intelligent, and determined people, and they, in a way, they funneled their deep distress into this effort. So I think, you know, that now it can be wild and it can be unregulated and it can be sometimes wrong, but it taps into people's fury, and people join in.
Now I'm going to, people have had time to think of questions. Are there any questions from the audience before I monopolise? We have one right in the middle here. This gentleman here, Lucy, or Fiona. Can you put your hand up, please, sir, so they can find you? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm the head chimp, the editor-in-chief of The Age, Andrew Holden. Margaret, can I throw the question to you? I know you don't think you should be in the spotlight, but I found Julian's comment about an organisation doing a well-researched complaint on behalf of the community. Is that something the university's Centre for Advancing Journalism should do?
Well, strange you should ask, Andrew, because we were having a discussion about this quite recently at the Centre. I don't think it is my personal view, and I haven't spoken with my colleagues, but I don't think it is the role of a university or a centre at a university to foster complaints. But we do have a role in education. We do run short courses, and something we have discussed and may well look at is running a course about how the system of media self-regulation works for perhaps community members and community groups, with the idea of assisting people to be able to have recourse when they feel they have a complaint. So that is something that we considered doing, and something which I hope we will do. And it would be great to think that the industry might actually be enthusiastic about that and get on board, rather than seeing it as an attack. What do you think of the chances, Andrew?
Always welcome criticism.
Oh, yes, I've experienced that.
Margaret, could I perhaps say on that I didn't mean necessarily that the group only thinks about bringing a complaint to us. In most cases, I actually think the agitation would be better devoted towards setting appropriate standards and monitoring their enforcement. My worry about, you know, say the Molly Lord case in Wollongong and others is that I do think they're often transitory and they don't develop a code for the future. They just sort of are a general, you know, warning, back off, which may or may not last. But even if it does, they're not replaced by anything which gives any real guidance to what people can and can't do, you know, with a helicopter or going onto land without approval. We, I could mention, because you were in Christchurch at the time, we're now doing standards in relation to access to patients in hospital, where it was a common practice for journalists to deliberately not identify themselves as such and sneak in. And in Christchurch, as you may remember, there was a fuss actually about Australian TV people interviewing someone who they felt wasn't in a state to be interviewed. So we need to try and get ahead of those situations. We didn't have a complaint about it, but we tried to get out with specific standards, much more specific than anyone has at the moment. News Limited, for example, at the moment has a quite unrealistically utopian standard. Basically says don't go in. Now that's not going to be complied with because it's too tough, and we're trying to spell it out in greater detail.
Okay, we have another question there, and then Gail down the front here.
Does the panel think current legislation will effectively protect journalists from having to disclose their sources? If not, what changes would you suggest?
Scott, do you want to have a go at that?
I can start. Federally, I think we're better off than in some of the states and territories where there's a real patchwork. And I found with a touch of irony the extraordinary front page hysteria over threats to journalistic freedom that resulted from these rather timid reforms that got put up a few weeks ago. And yet I think at last count there are 5 journalists either before the courts now or at threat of being before the courts over source disclosure. Federally, not because the government wanted it, because it was one actually quite good example of the crossbenchers collaborating with the opposition to roll over the government on federal shield laws. And I was just reminded by a gentleman down the front here, we've got quite an expansive definition of journalist here, and that we would leave that to the courts to decide who could avail themselves of the protection of shield laws. The idea that you would have a major shareholder of a big media company suing 2 journalists in her own stable over stuff that she didn't like, there's your threat to press freedom right there.
And being feted at a recent dinner with the head of the other major news corporation. Look, what always fascinates me is how brilliant judges are at finding ways of getting around whatever legislation is passed to ensure that journalists don't have to protect their sources. There's the newspaper rule, there's various shield laws. Always, it seems to me, when judges are asked to balance the interests of free speech and a free media against the interests of justice, they're judges. You know? The interests of justice, which is the person that happens to be in front of them wanting to sue somebody, always wins. And I think the very last thing you would want to do if you ever did have a statutory regulator is put a judge in charge of it. Honestly, I think they are a much greater danger to freedom of the press than anything the Parliament was trying to do. And the irony is that the Australian, among others, has campaigned long and hard against a charter of freedom of some sort because we don't want to give judges the power. You know, they should be the elected representatives who make laws, and we shouldn't give power to judges to decide, you know, what our freedoms are. Well, I kind of agree with them, but I'm seeing very little outcry about the fact that our 5 of the best journalists in this country, they're not scumbags, they are 5 of the best journalists in this country, are facing the threat of going to prison for not revealing their sources. It's a ridiculous situation.
Yeah, I don't know all the facts in the 5 cases, but it has struck me, as it has with Jonathan and Scott, that this, I would have thought, should be in the forefront of discussion about freedom of the press at the moment, not the other stuff that has been. There's been another example, for example, in Fairfax with one of their leading investigative journalists who allegedly had a threat passed on to her by a barrister. You know, now, may not be correct, I'm not asserting that, but it seems to me there were issues for the legal profession there apart from anything else, and that should have been a freedom of the press issue. But to me, the main question actually flowing from what you asked is what's a journalist? And we've got to confront this. I differ perhaps a bit from Scott here. I don't think it helps. I mean, how much comfort is a whistleblower going to have if they think they're going to have to wait until they get to the High Court to know whether they're protected because they gave it to the right kind of blogger or online-only person? I believe if these privileges, nearly all of the privileges I think the journalists have now, I would support, but I think they're going to be at risk if we don't define who is a professional journalist who gets some of these privileges. If everyone can get them, they'll be eroded. I mean, why should there be a shield law for everyone? You know, why should any journalist be able to, any person be able to write something and not disclose the alleged source? They can completely invent it. Similarly with closed courts. If we want judges to be willing to allow journalists to stay in closed courts when everyone else is thrown out. We've got to have some definition, and even a rudimentary reason to believe that these people have some training in and commitment to standards. And if we don't have that category available for people who want to provide or maintain privileges, the privileges won't be given or they won't be maintained. And it's becoming even more important now when the division between journalist and commercial interests is increasing. You've got that here with the AFL having, I think, more football journalists than the Herald Sun. You've got it with the Commonwealth Bank now, who are running their own journalists. This is a huge issue for the future, to make sure that these people who are claiming to be journalists are subject to adequate standards. We saw it at the Mardi Gras in Sydney recently, where a person took a photograph of a person being allegedly beaten up in the street. When told to back off, said, "I'm from the media." Now, I don't know, I'd be very surprised if they were. Now, if that's going to build up, then the media itself, the genuine media, will suffer. If other people are allowed to claim that they have the special privileges that have been given to journalists in the media, when they're not entitled to them and they're not willing to comply with the standards and not subject to some rudimentary test, those privileges will be lost. And I think the media really needs to get real about this.
We have another question down the front here. Can you go? No, just wait for the microphone.
Mm-hmm.
Another one.
We were talking about intimidation and bullying and bias, and we mentioned one major news organisation and the antidote to bias you've discussed as being a multiplicity or a diversity of voices, and Jonathan, you were saying another big voice that was a gorilla in the room was the ABC. The other gorilla in the room, I suppose, is the looming federal election and the great probability that the coalition will get in. What's going to happen to that other voice, the ABC?
Who knows? Look. My guess is, I forget who it was that made that well-known statement, but somebody from the Liberal Party made that statement that the ABC is our enemies talking to our friends. There are a great many coalition voters who love the ABC, especially, of course, in the bush. The National Party is probably a bigger supporter of the ABC than the ALP is, or even possibly the Greens. So I don't think that privatisation or anything like that is on the table. I do think that there will be a lot of pressure on the Abbott government, if such a thing eventuates, to limit the ABC's activities in those areas where we are directly competing with commercial media who are relying not on advertising, as the commercial television has always done, or commercial radio, but on subscriptions, particularly, of course, paywalls on text-based information. I think that we could well see the ABC being told, if you want to do all this stuff online, news online, opinion online, we are not going to allow you to do that on taxpayers' dollars. You have to put a paywall up and make that pay for itself, because it's not fair on Fairfax and News and the other people who are trying to charge people for the same sort of material. That's, and I think that's a debatable issue. I don't think it's a clean cut, what a horror. I think that could happen. Other than that, and of course we could have our budget cut, as we did last time around, and again, I mean, it's always going to be contestable how much money should go into this particular activity as opposed to that. It's going to be contestable, and it's going to be more contestable under a coalition government, as always is. That's life.
Scott.
One of the small bright spots in the package of bills that didn't go through Parliament was that in one of the bills that did, we were able to get up a charter amendment to the ABC's charter and to SBS's to entrench its right to operate online. So before that, the charter explicitly talks about broadcast, and obviously the internet's not a broadcast medium. That's the least interesting part of it. That's now been embedded. So I would say the ABC is now at greater risk of funding cuts, and presumably Media Watch should be the first thing
I don't think so.
in the firing line to come after that charter amendment and knock out the ABC's presence online or force them under a paywall or something of that sort. I think probably you would need to go back and amend the Charter. So then in all of this, I don't think it's inevitable. Maybe I'm the last person in the country who thinks it's not inevitable that there'll be a change of government. What's certainly not inevitable is that Abbott will hold the numbers in both chambers to do things like Charter amendments. Not, you can kick the hell out of the budget without recourse to Parliament up to a point. But whether a Charter amendment would pass the Senate will actually really depend what happens later this year.
Now we have time just for one more question.
Can I ask a question too at some point?
It's
a really easy one. Mine's real trivial. I'll come at the end.
Okay, so one more question from the audience. I think there was a gentleman here who had his hand up. Sorry, right at the back. Okay, rightio, we've got the microphone. Okay.
Oh, you can hear me? Okay.
So,
hi. This is directed at Jonathan. I'm a RMIT media student. And we're currently doing an assignment on the changing news cycle and the way that news is delivered. And I just wanted to ask you, in regards to the 24-hour news cycle and the way that journalists can now write a breaking story at any point, any time of day, compared to how it used to be, do you think that this is a good shift in the way that news is being delivered? And how do you think that this affects the way it's received for the audience?
Look, I haven't worked in daily news much at any stage in my career, and certainly not in the last few years. So I haven't got any personal experience of this, but what everybody tells you is obviously, and as Julian said earlier tonight, clearly it's much tougher for a journalist to do what was absolutely insisted on in the old days, that you do check your facts, that you do make the phone calls, that you do get the other side, that you do all of those things. When you've got to put it up within half an hour, you can't. And so you put it up and then you start doing those other things. And as Julian said, once it's up, it's up. Now, I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, the competition to get the story up first in most newsrooms is intense. Whether the consumer actually cares, I mean, if they're used to going to the Fin Review's website rather than the Aussies, I don't think they're there kind of saying who's got it up first, But the journals have that intense competitive feeling that's part of their job, and their editors do, and so on. So look, it makes good journalism tougher. And anyway, there are fewer journalists all the time in the big news organisations, and what they're being asked to produce every day, the number of stories and the number of deadlines is going up all the time. So of course, something has to go, and what goes. Well, the first thing that went some time ago was 3 pints in the pub at lunchtime, which was absolutely routine when I was at Journo in the 70s.
Tragedy.
But now what's going is thorough journalism.
Scott, you had a question.
Yeah, a real easy one, just to finish up, that I want to pitch to these guys while we've got them up on stage, if that's all right, and it's on the subject, a subject that's pretty close to my heart. Climate change, if we're going to end on a trivial note, that we have got science flowing in from reputable and respected institutions around the country and around the world that is beyond catastrophic. It's worse than we even thought a decade ago. And yet, to gauge the public mood, a large number of people are completely switched off. The sense of urgency is gone. There's no real sense, if you flick through the newspapers, that there's really anything to see here, even though actually the theatre is filled up with smoke. You've got the point.
Scott, bring it to a question.
Is there anything that we can do? Because I lay a large fraction of that at the feet of uncritical reporting. On the one hand, a climate scientist, on the other hand, let's hear from the IPA.
Is there anything we can do?
What can we do, if anything?
What can we do? Jonathan?
Why don't you ask Julian?
All right, Julian, what can we do?
Well, sorry to say this in the light of Jonathan having passed the buck, but I have to be cautious because we get quite a lot of complaints in this area. I do think there are things that could be done. Perhaps I'll just say that this is an area that I particularly have in mind where the rigour of the complaint is terribly important. Sometimes the problem, and you get this in lots of areas of policy debate, the problem is that extremism and distortion is often combated by extremism and distortion. And the extremists pick the extremists on the other side and paint them as representing the other view. And it's why if one's wanting to get a rigorous and rational analysis of an issue, one has to be tougher on one's own renegades and extremists than on the other side, because it just gives a free kick to the other side. And so some of the coverage is able to lampoon and distort the views of those who believe in climate change because of ill-considered statements. And so that's a problem. But also the rigour of the analysis, I won't go into detail, but for example, the position in relation to Antarctic land ice is very different from the position in relation to Antarctic sea ice. And you can get all sorts of falsehoods and distortions, etc., put across, and unless someone really does the rigorous research to nail the distortions, it's very hard for a body like ours or anyone else to be able to point them out. There can be real skill, it's part of the business of some people, at dog whistling and at distorting without being catchable that they're doing it.
Now we are nearly out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief, Jonathan.
Well, it is an enormously difficult issue. What we try to focus on Media Watch is the reporting of the science when the science is reported wrongly. However, what we can't really deal with is the fact, is what to do when the science isn't reported at all. And that is the bigger problem, actually. You know, time and again, little tiny stories of really no significance are blown up as though they're a big deal if they have a sort of anti-global warming significance. But stories of major significance that are happening, especially in overseas, don't get reported at all. And they're just gone. They're just not there. I think the reporting of climate change in this country has been an absolute disgrace. And that is one of the major reasons why we have one of the most the smallest number of, I hate the word believers. It's not a question of belief, it's a question of people who accept the science or don't accept the science, in my view. But the reason for that is that we have so many people who do not accept the science is because they're not told what the science is. But again, it's one of those things that's very tough to regulate. You can ping them when they get it wrong, but you can't ping them when they don't do it at all.
Okay, now I am going to have to wrap it up there, and certainly not because we've exhausted the topic. I'd very much like to thank our speakers. All of them have come into state just for tonight's event. Scott was in Broome this morning, I believe, so that's an enormous trip to have made. I think they're all here because they think this is important. I'm sure all of you are here too. So I'd ask you to join me, first of all, in thanking our panellists. Secondly, I'd like to thank all of you. Some of you are familiar faces, but many of you, I think this is the first of our events that you've attended. Please do go onto our website and sign up to our mailing list. We hold regular events throughout the year on all aspects of journalism. Our next one is actually part of our regional New News programme. We'll be in Traralgon talking about the future of news media in Victoria's regions. And lastly, I'd like to thank the staff of the Centre for Advancing Journalism, without whom nothing would happen. Lucy Chancellor-Wheel and Fiona Sanner, who is somewhere, who have really put this all together. I just come up with ideas and throw them at them and they make them happen. So I'd like to thank the staff of the Centre. Thank you.